The heat in the Black Hills doesn't just burn. It bites. It's a dry, jagged kind of heat that gets under a man's fingernails and stays there until the winter snows come to wash it out. Elias Thorne was 54 years old, and he'd spent 30 of those years trying to outrun the ghost of a war that had no winners. He lived alone. He liked it that way. Silence was the only thing that didn't ask him for more than he could give. He was out checking the north fence line when he saw the buzzards. They weren't circling. They were landing. That was a sign of something that had already given up the ghost. Elias adjusted the weight of the Winchester on his shoulder and nudged his mare, Cider, toward the gully. Then he saw her. Clara was standing at the edge of the wash, her dress torn at the shoulder, her face a mask of dust and dried salt. She wasn't crying. Out here, tears were a luxury the sun didn't allow. In her hand, she held a heavy, rusted coat. It was shaking. Elias dismounted. He didn't rush. Rushing in the desert was a good way to find a shallow grave. "Clara," he said. His voice was like gravel shifting in a pan. "Put the iron down." She didn't look at him. She was looking down into the scrub brush. "Is he finally dead?" she gasped. The words came out thin, like a thread about to snap. Elias stepped to the edge of the wash. Down in the dirt, tangled in the thorns, lay a man. His coat was expensive, fine wool, now stained with a dark, blooming crimson. His face was gray. This was Silas Vane, the man who had bought up half the county with blood money and called it progress. The man who had burned Clara's father's barn with the livestock still inside. Elias knelt beside the body. He reached out a callous hand, pressing 2 fingers against the man's neck. He waited. He felt the wind moan through the sagebrush. He felt the heat radiating off the stones. Silas Vane's chest shifted. A shallow, wet wheeze escaped his cracked lips. Elias looked up at Clara. Her eyes were wide, pleading for a different answer. "He's still breathing," Elias said. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Clara raised the colt. The hammer clicked back, a small sound that felt like a cannon blast in the quiet. "He can't be," she whispered. "He doesn't get to be." Elias stood up. He didn't reach for his gun. He just stood between the girl and the dying man. "Not like this, Clara. The land has enough blood in it already." It took 2 hours to get him back to Elias's cabin. Elias had rigged a travois behind his horse, the wooden poles scraping a long, jagged line to the dust. It looked like a scar being carved into the earth. Clara followed on her own horse, her eyes fixed on the back of Silas Vane's head. She looked like she was waiting for him to die, just so she could stop holding her breath. The cabin was small. 1 room. The smell of old pine and wood smoke. Elias cleared the table, throwing a cleanish sheet over the scarred timber. Together, they hoisted the man onto the wood. Silas groaned. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated pain. Elias started a fire in the stove, not for warmth. The afternoon sun was still pouring through the window, but to boil water. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had stitched up soldiers in the mud of Tennessee. "Why are we doing this?" Clara asked. She was sitting in the corner, her hands still stained with the dirt of the wash. "He's a monster, Elias. You know what he did. You know what he's planning to do to the rest of the ranchers." Elias didn't look up. He was busy sharpening a small, thin blade. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound filled the room. "I know," Elias said, "but a man doesn't choose who he saves based on a ledger. You start doing that, you're no better than the men who write the laws in the city." He began to cut away the wool coat. The wound was in the shoulder, high and messy. A lead ball was still buried deep in the muscle. It had soured. The skin around it was angry, purple, and hot to the touch. "He was running," Clara said, her voice distant. His own men turned on him. Greed is a hungry dog, Elias. Eventually, it bites the hand that feeds it. Elias nodded. He'd seen it before. Men like Vane thought they could buy loyalty. But in the West, loyalty was something you earned with sweat, not gold. He poured a bit of whiskey over the wound. Silas Vane's eyes flew open. They were bloodshot, wild with fever. He looked at the ceiling, then at Elias. Then his gaze drifted to Clara. He tried to speak. A bubble of red foam formed on his lips. Quiet now, Elias muttered. The Reaper's already at the door. Don't invite him in. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the bubbling of the water and a heavy, rhythmic breathing of the man on the table. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How a man's life can hang on something as simple as a piece of lead and a steady hand. Out here in the West, stories don't always have heroes and villains. Sometimes they just have people trying to survive the choices they made yesterday. If this story is making you think about the choices in your own life, or if you just appreciate a tale told with a bit of grit, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us keep these fires burning. And if you want to see if Silas Vane makes it to morning, or if Clara finally pulls that trigger, make sure you're subscribed. The night is long, and we're just getting started. Take a sip of your coffee. Settle in. Let's see what the dark brings. By midnight, the fever had taken hold. Silas Vane wasn't a powerful land baron anymore. He was just a man shivering under a wool blanket, his mind wandering to the counting houses of his youth. Elias sat by the stove, whittling a piece of cedar. Clara hadn't moved from her chair. She was watching Vane like a hawk watching a mouse. He talked in his sleep, Clara said suddenly. Elias stopped whittling. What did he say? Names, she replied. He said the names of the people whose land he took. He said my father's name. But he didn't say it like a prayer, Elias. He said it was like a debt he'd already forgotten. Suddenly, Silas Vane gasped. His hand reached out, clawing at the air. Elias moved to his side, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. The safe? Vane whispered. His voice was a dry rattle. The papers, they're in the cellar, beneath the floorboards of the old mission. Elias narrowed his eyes. The old mission was a ruin 5 miles south. It was where the town's records had been kept before the fire of '82. What papers, Silas? Elias asked, his voice low. And the deeds, Vane wheezed. They aren't legal. I forged them. All of them. The territory. It still belongs to the families. If they find the originals, I'm a dead man anyway. Clara stood up so fast her chair clattered against the floorboards. You stole our lie for a lie? Vane didn't answer. He slipped back into the gray fog of the fever. Clara looked at Elias. The anger in her face had been replaced by something colder, something more purposeful. If those papers exist, we have to get them. We can save the valley. We can stop the auctions. Elias looked at the man on the table. He looked at the rifle leaning against the door. He knew what happened next. Silas Vane's men, the ones who had shot him and left him for the buzzards, they weren't just running. They were searching. They knew Vane was alive, or they knew he had the location of those papers. They're coming, aren't they? Clara asked, reading his silence. They're coming, Elias said. A man like Vane doesn't leave loose ends, especially loose end that can breathe. The wind picked up then, rattling the shutters of the cabin. It's the kind of wind that carries the smell of rain and gunpowder. You can almost hear the hoofbeats in the distance if you listen close enough. We're about to find out what Elias Thorne is willing to risk for a man he despises. Before we get to the final standoff, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know the time where you are. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're enjoying this journey into the dusty heart of the Old West, hit that subscribe button. It's the only way to make sure you don't miss the next chapter. Now, pour yourself another cup. The riders are almost here. It happened at 3 a.m. The wolf hour, the old-timers called it. The time when the world is at its darkest and a man's soul is at its weakest. Elias heard them first. 4 riders. Maybe 5. They weren't trying to be quiet. They rode with the arrogance of men who held the law in their pockets. Get under the bed, Elias told Clara. I can fight, she said, her hand on a rusted colt. I know you can, Elias said, looking her in the eye. But if I go down, you're the only one who knows about the mission. You're the only one who can save the valley. Now, get it. She hesitated, then slid into the shadows beneath the heavy oak frame. Elias stepped out onto the porch. He didn't take the Winchester. He took his old double-barreled 10-gauge. It was a cruel weapon for a cruel night. The riders pulled up just outside the circle of light from a cabin window. The leader was a man named Miller. He had a face like a hatchet and a soul to match. "Evening, Thorne," Miller called out. His horse danced nervously, catching the scent of the blood inside the cabin. "We're looking for a bit of property that went missing. A man in a fancy coat." "Nothing here but the wind and the dust, Miller," Elias said. He stood perfectly still. He was a statue of oak and iron. "Don't lie to me, old man," Miller spat. "We followed the travois marks. We know he's inside. Give him to us, and we'll leave you the cabin. We might even leave you your life." "He's a guest under my roof," Elias said, "and where I come from, you don't hand guests over to the wolves." Miller laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "He's a snake, Thorne. He'd sell your soul for a nickel." "Maybe so," Elias said, his thumb clicking the first hammer of the 10-gauge. "But I'm not selling mine to you." Miller went for his belt. He was fast, but Elias had been waiting for the move since the moment he saw the buzzards. Boom! The first barrel of the 10-gauge roared, a wall of lead and flame that lit up the night. Miller's horse reared, throwing him into the dirt. The other riders scattered, diving behind to cover the well and the fence posts. Lee began to chew into the logs of the cabin. Elias dove back inside, slamming the heavy bar across the door. "Are you okay?" Clara yelled over the roar of the gunfire. "I've been better," Elias shouted back. He moved to the window, poking the barrel of the shotgun through a gap in the shutters. Inside the room, Silas Vane had woken up. The sound of the battle had cleared the fog of the fever. He was staring at the door, his face pale, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "They're here," Vane whispered. "They're here for you, Silas," Elias said, not turning around. "You want to live? You better start praying." Vane looked at Clara, who had crawled out from under the bed. She was holding the Colt with both hands, aimed straight at the door. The girl, Vane wheezed. "In my pocket, the key." Clara hesitated, then reached into the blood-stained folds of Vane's vest. Her fingers closed around a small, brass key. "It's for the chest and the mission," Vane said. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was no greed in his eyes, only fear, and maybe just a sliver of regret. "Save your land. Just don't let them take me." The fight lasted 20 minutes, but it felt like 20 years. Elias moved from window to window, his shotgun speaking with the voice of thunder. He took a hit in the fleshy part of his thigh, but he didn't even flinch. He'd had worse. Outside, 2 of Miller's men lay still in the dirt. The others were losing their nerve. Outlaws don't like a fair fight, and Elias Thorne was making it very expensive for them to stay. "We're burning it," Miller screamed from the darkness. "We're burning you out, Thorne." Elias saw the flicker of a torch. He knew he had one shot. He looked at Clara, the back window. "Take the horses and run. Go to the mission." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Elias lied. Clara looked at him, then at Vane, then back at Elias. She leaned over and kissed the old rancher on the cheek, a fleeting touch of grace in a world of violence. Then she disappeared into the back of the cabin. Elias turned back to the door. He waited until he heard the soft sound of hooves fading into the night. Then he did something Silas Vane didn't expect. He opened the door. He stood there in the frame, the firelight from the stove behind him, making him look like a giant. He saw Miller standing by the well, torch in hand. Miller froze. He raised his revolver, but Elias was faster. The second barrel of the 10-gauge sang its final song. Miller flew backward, the torch falling into the dust and sputtering out. The remaining riders didn't wait to see what happened next. They turned their horses and rode hard for the horizon. leaving their pride and their dead in the dirt. When the sun rose, the cabin was still standing. Elias sat on the porch, a bandage tied tight around his leg. He was cleaning his shotgun. Silas Vane was still on the table. He was alive, but life was fading from him like the light of a guttering candle. Clara rode back into the yard an hour later. She wasn't alone. She was followed by the sheriff and half a dozen men from the neighboring ranches. In her saddlebag, she carried a bundle of yellow papers, held together by a black ribbon. The deeds, the real ones. The sheriff stepped into the cabin. He looked at Silas Vane. Silas Vane, you're under arrest for forgery, arson, and a list of crimes as long as my arm. Vane didn't respond. He just stared at the ceiling. Clara walked over to Elias. She handed him a cup of coffee. It was hot, black, and bitter, just the way he liked it. Is he dead? She asked, looking at Vane. Elias took a sip of the coffee. He looked at the man who had tried to steal a valley and ended up with nothing but a hole in his shoulder and a legacy of shame. Not yet, Elias said, but Silas Vane that mattered. He died the moment you found those papers. They took Vane away on a wagon. He'd survived to see a judge, but he'd never see the Black Hills as a free man again. The valley stayed with the families. The auctions were canceled. The land breathed a sigh of relief. Elias Thorne went back to his fence lines. He went back to his silence. But sometimes, in the evenings, Clara would ride over with a basket of bread or a fresh tin of coffee. They wouldn't talk much. They didn't need to. You see, out here, the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deep you bury it. It might take a bullet. It might take a fire. Or it might just take... How about you? If you found your worst enemy dying in the dirt, what would you do? Would you reach for your gun? Or would you reach for the whiskey? It's an easy question to answer in the light of day, but it's a lot harder when the buzzards are circling. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that there's still a bit of justice left in this old world, give us a like and a comment. We read every single one. And if you want to keep riding with us through the dust and the shadows of the West, hit that subscribe button. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember, the sun always rises, but it's what we do in the dark that defines us. We'll see you on the next trail. Until then, keep your powder dry and your heart steady. Good night.